The loneliness you feel right now doesn't come from the fact that you're alone in your room. And you can tell, because there are people surrounded by others, with full schedules, in relationships, and still feeling the same coldness inside that you're feeling at this very moment. Loneliness doesn't come from the outside. It comes from something much older than your environment. Throughout the 20th century, the psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung wrote about a kind of suffering that no medication could cure and no company could fill. For decades, this state was mistaken for sadness, then for anxiety, then for a lack of purpose. You've probably already noticed a curious detail. The more connected the world has become, the lonelier each person has felt on the inside. There has never been so much possibility for immediate contact. It has never been so easy to send a message, hop on a call, or see someone's face from the other side of the planet in real time. And yet, at the end of another day, the feeling that remains is this. The one quietly pulsing inside you right now. A kind of internal chill that no screen can warm. Alan Watts, in the book, On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, made an observation that travels across decades and arrives whole in this late-night hour. He said that modern man has become a stranger to himself because he learned to live entirely on the surface, on the shell, inside the social role he was handed before he was even old enough to refuse it. You became the efficient professional who delivers on deadline, who is also the child who calls on Sundays, who is also the understanding partner, who is also the good-humored friend when the group gets together. Layer upon layer of performance stacked on top of a center that almost no one teaches you to look for. And when the shell starts to crack, when the role no longer convinces even the one playing it, that feeling emerges, the one you know so well. A discreet, polite emptiness that shows up in the small gaps of the day, in that instant between one meeting and the next, in that exact minute before falling asleep, when the last notification goes quiet and only you remain. This emptiness is not a defect. This restlessness is not weakness. It is the precise symptom of someone whose mask has grown too narrow for the face that has been growing beneath it. And that face, even if you don't yet recognize it, is asking to breathe. The mask is more exhausting than it seems. Maybe you remember an old pattern. Since childhood, something in you has always been slightly out of place. In the school circles, there was always a part of you that observed instead of simply joining in. In family conversations, you would hear phrases repeated for years and feel that something important was never actually being said. At work, while others seemed satisfied with goals and rewards, you were left with the silent impression that it wasn't enough, that something was missing where purpose should have been. Carl Gustav Jung, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, described this kind of person with a rare delicacy. He said that there are those whose inner life is so intense that the outer world starts to seem like a blurry, noisy, sometimes aggressively superficial backdrop. It's not arrogance, it's psychic constitution. While most people find the measure of reality in the visible, there are others for whom the visible is only the tip of something much larger. These people are often called strange, intense, difficult, complicated. They are almost never called by what they really are. People with a different compass, pointing toward a north that no one around them can see. I know this is hard to hear, but it needs to be said. If you have always felt different, stop carrying that as shame. Your difference is not a manufacturing flaw. It's a calling. The human psyche rarely produces deep restlessness without reason. When it does, it is warning you that there is something to be lived that has not yet been lived. And here we arrive at a concept that Jung developed with almost surgical precision. He called the persona, that social construction each of us assembles over the years in order to be accepted, approved of, loved. The word comes from Greek theater and literally means mask. Everyone has one. No one makes it through life without needing that minimum level of protection to deal with the world. The problem begins when a person identifies so deeply with the mask that they forget the face beneath it. When performance replaces existence. You've spent years being who others expected you to be. Maybe you chose the profession that pleased other people. Maybe you stayed in relationships simply because leaving would be a hassle and would cause awkwardness. Maybe you adopted opinions that were never yours, tastes that never matched you. routines that never made sense. All of that comes at a steep cost, not in your wallet, but in a quieter currency, an existential fatigue that no long weekend can dissolve, an exhaustion from being a character for too long. Jung warned that when someone becomes completely glued to the mask, they lose contact with the soul. And the soul, when it feels abandoned for too long, does not scream. It starts to drain the brightness out of things. It takes the flavor out of food, the charm out of conversations, the meaning out of projects, until what's left is this strange state where everything keeps functioning on the outside, and nothing pulses anymore on the inside. The silence you feel right now, the one that brought you here, might very well be the soul's request for space, for air, for truth. Observe, with some honesty, how the mask holds itself up in your everyday life. There is a version of you that shows up at work, controlled, efficient, ready to respond and deliver. There's another one that shows up with family, more restrained, often swallowing entire sentences to avoid triggering old frictions. There's a third one that shows up with friends, looser, maybe even funny, but almost always steering clear of subjects that hurt. And there's a fourth one, more recent, that shows up on social media, carefully calibrated to create the right impression, the right number of likes, the image you'd like to have circulating. Each of these versions requires a small amount of energy to maintain. None of them, on its own, seems too heavy. But when you add them all up, day after day, year after year, what remains is a deep exhaustion that no amount of rest can recover. It's the fatigue of someone who has lived too long as a representation, and too little as an existence. And the clearest symptom of this exhaustion shows up precisely in the moments when, with no role to play, you find yourself face to face with yourself and don't quite know what to do with that encounter. You're not alone in this feeling. Many people go through it without knowing how to name it. Pause for a moment and observe the choreography of your last few days. There was probably a moment when you woke up already tired, before even the first cup of coffee, with the vague sense of having to respond to an invisible list of obligations, whose meaning you can't even remember choosing. The blue light of the phone arriving before the sun, work group messages casually invading the weekend, the credit card bill landing in your inbox like a silent reminder that you are, somehow, chasing after a life that always seems one block ahead of you. In the middle of all this, in some brief gap, a question comes up, one you try to brush away quickly because it's too uncomfortable to face between one meeting and another. A question that blends purpose, direction, and lifetime into a single restlessness that has nowhere to land. And that question, even when brushed aside, doesn't go away. It retreats to the back of the mind and waits for a moment when the defenses drop. A moment like this one, for instance, when the hustle of the day dissolves and you finally have a piece of stillness large enough for it to come back. Before we move on, hold on to one detail. In a little while, we're going to touch on an aspect of your psyche that Jung described with great courage, an aspect that scares almost everyone who hears about it for the first time, an aspect that once faced completely changes the way you see yourself, judge yourself, and forgive yourself. We'll get there. It's completely understandable that you'd be afraid to face all of this at once, especially after a full day of trying to be useful to others while something inside you is falling apart. But we need to make an important distinction before moving forward. There are two very different types of isolation, and confusing one with the other can cost years of a life. There is painful isolation, which is the sensation of being rejected, of not finding a bridge to anyone, of being locked out of the world. That one hurts because it is absence. And there is the other form, which is exactly the opposite, fertile solitude, the solitude of awakening. This one is not absence, it's presence. The presence of yourself, for the first time in years, without intermediaries. Jung called this individuation, and he was emphatic about it. The path to becoming who you really are must be walked alone. No one walks it for anyone else. Guides can point directions, books can offer maps, conversations can bring flashes of insight, but the steps are yours and yours alone. No one can do it for you. And that's why, when someone begins to awaken, they also naturally begin to pull away from the collective noise, Not out of dislike, out of psychic necessity, like a plant that needs a little shade so the root can grow deep before the canopy appears. You're not falling ill, you're in process. And the process, seen from the outside, always looks like a crisis. Seen from the inside, it's gestation. One of the most curious things about our time is the almost instinctive terror people have developed of silence. Notice how any minimal pause is immediately filled with something. The TV on with no one watching, the podcast playing in the background while doing the dishes, the phone opened before even getting out of bed. The volume of life seems to have a mandatory minimum, and any attempt to lower it causes an almost physical discomfort. Alan Watts observed this phenomenon with uncomfortable clarity. He said that modern man tries to cure emptiness with more noise, more consumption, more stimulation, without realizing that emptiness is not cured by being avoided. It is cured by being inhabited. There's an enormous difference between running from stillness and walking through stillness. The one who runs spends their whole life searching for a new distraction before the previous one ends. The one who walks through discovers on the other side something that cannot be bought anywhere, a tranquility that does not depend on external circumstances. If at this moment you are seeking that kind of calm, if something in you has finally grown tired of the noise, that is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that your psyche is ready for a kind of conversation that hasn't happened yet. The conversation with yourself, without any middlemen. Before moving on, it's worth bringing back a simple observation. No one taught you how to be alone. That content was never part of the curriculum. We learned math, we learned grammar rules, we learned how to behave in front of authority figures, but the most fundamental art, the one of being at peace in your own company, was set aside as if it were irrelevant. And it isn't. It's the skill that holds up all the others. Because someone who can't be with themselves for a while without falling into despair ends up outsourcing to the entire world the responsibility of filling their own absence. They enter relationships just to avoid being alone. They accept jobs they hate to avoid having to look inward. They consume compulsively to numb the restlessness. The result is an entire life built on fleeing from an encounter that sooner or later ends up happening anyway, usually on a late night much like this. 1. Now we can touch on that aspect I asked you to hold on to. Jung described a part of the human psyche that he called the shadow. It's not something exotic or far away. It's everything that over the course of your life, you learn to consider unacceptable in yourself, and began to hide, first from others, and then even from yourself. Anger you could never express because it wasn't welcome at home. Desires that were marked as wrong before you even understood what they were. Parts of you that were ridiculed, repressed, punished, until you learned to shove them under an internal rug and pretend they didn't exist. The problem is that nothing that gets shoved down actually disappears. It just vanishes from the conscious field and starts operating beneath the surface, influencing your reactions, your relationships, your choices, everything you project onto others without realizing it. You know those people who irritate you disproportionately, who get under your skin with a strange kind of speed. Almost always, they carry visibly some trait that your own shadow carries in silence. That's why deep contact with yourself is frightening, because true stillness interrupts the projection. With no others to observe, judge, or complain about, you're left facing what has always been in you and that you never wanted to see. That's where most people run. They turn on the TV, open social media, call someone on the phone, invent a fake urgency. Anything to avoid staying in the quiet room where the shadow begins to reveal itself. I understand that noticing this can be painful. It's completely valid to feel that fear. But notice one thing. It's only by looking at what has been hidden that a person becomes whole again. Everything that remains in the dark keeps ruling you. Everything that is brought into the light can finally be chosen, integrated, redirected. You, without realizing it, are already on the threshold of that encounter. The withdrawal is simply the room where it takes place. Light, where before there was only rug on top. A point that often gets misinterpreted deserves attention here. Integrating this hidden side does not mean acting out every repressed impulse. It does not mean becoming an aggressive person because you realized you'd been hiding anger. It does not mean abandoning relationships because you identified accumulated fatigue. Integrating is different from dumping. Integrating is a process that begins with recognizing that something exists, moves through welcoming its origin, and ends with understanding the function it serves within your story. Only then, consciously deciding how to handle it in the present. Someone who never allowed themselves to feel anger doesn't need to become an angry person. They just need to stop being a hostage to an anger operating underneath, disguised as vague irritation, inexplicable fatigue, resentful passivity. Jung spoke of making the unconscious conscious. The phrase sounds abstract until you realize how many things in your daily life continue to govern your reactions without you being able to name them. Certain people trigger you. Certain situations freeze you. Certain topics put you immediately on the defensive. These sensitive points are not random. They are maps. They show where the psychic material is still raw, waiting to be integrated. And conscious withdrawal creates the time, the calm, and the attention needed to start deciphering that map, without the constant interference of the outside world. I want to propose now a shift in perspective that Watts spent decades teaching, one that usually seems too simple until it's actually lived. The deep sense of separation, that intimate experience of being an isolated self inside a body, looking out at a world that is out there, distant, hostile, indifferent, is largely a cultural construction, not an absolute truth. From childhood, we were taught to perceive ourselves as closed units, individual egos inside bags of skin, separated from everything and everyone. This notion seems so obvious that no one questions it. But look carefully. Where exactly do you end and the rest begin? At the edge of the skin. But the skin breathes the air. The air comes from the atmosphere. The atmosphere is produced by forests, oceans, processes happening thousands of miles away from you. The food that formed your body came from the soil, the sun, the rain. Every one of your cells is a temporary knot in an immense web stretching across billions of years of life on Earth. The separation you feel is real as a sensation, but illusory at its essence. Watts called this the taboo against knowing who you really are, because if the veil fell, the experience would change in nature. It would stop being the pain of the isolated one and become the discovery of the connected one. But that change requires first walking through the withdrawal you're living now. There is no shortcut. Only those who truly face the separation can see, on the other side, that it was never what it seemed. And maybe that's exactly why, in certain moments, you look around and get the strange impression that people are sleepwalking awake, not as a moral judgment, but as an attentive observation of what you see. They repeat the same patterns, consume the same products, defend the same opinions with the same words, without ever seeming interrupted by an underlying question. Watts called this state social hypnosis. We are born into a game whose rules were written before our arrival. We learn to play that game as if it were the only possible reality, and we spend our entire lives competing, accumulating, and comparing, without ever asking who we are. Who wrote these rules? Why we are playing? There is no malice in this. There is only conditioning, and conditioning works so well precisely because no one notices it operating. When someone begins to wake up, they also begin to find the game strange. They can no longer get excited about the same prizes. They can no longer take certain conflicts seriously. They feel, more and more, a kind of distance from the general noise. This is usually interpreted as arrogance, disinterest, coldness, or even illness. It is rarely interpreted as what it really is, the beginning of a way out, and the way out by definition is solitary, because the others are still inside, playing, and they look strangely at the one who has started to set the pieces down. It's only fair that at this point, a feeling similar to guilt shows up. Guilt for drifting away from old friends whose conversations have lost their spark. Guilt for no longer being able to get excited about what once excited you. Guilt for wanting stillness when others are offering company. This guilt is a leftover of the hypnosis. It appears because the internal social apparatus has learned to measure your worth by your ability to adjust to the collective rhythm. Feeling distant from the collective, in that logic, means failing. But anyone who studies the individuation process carefully notices that this distancing is a stage, not a destination. The person withdraws because they need to reorganize their inner world before returning to communal life with a different presence. It's not antisocial, it's simply the time needed before returning to company. First, the self is reconstituted, then the way of being with others is reconstituted. Skipping this stage is keeping the shell. Respecting it is what allows, later on, for old relationships to be revisited, some preserved with more truth, others released with more ease, and new ones found on frequencies compatible with who you've become. I'm not telling you this to make you anxious, but to wake you up. The restlessness that gives you no peace, that quiet voice that stubbornly insists you came here to do something beyond surviving and consuming, has a name within depth psychology. Jung called it the call of the psyche, a kind of inner voice that stops accepting a borrowed life, that refuses copies, that begins to demand, with polite firmness, authenticity. This call usually appears first as discomfort, then as chronic dissatisfaction, then as open crisis. It is not satisfied with distractions. The more you ignore it, the heavier it gets. The more you answer it, the more it becomes a compass. There is a sentence implicit throughout Jung's work that can be summarized like this: pain is the map. Whatever bothers you most, whatever keeps insisting on showing up when you try to quiet down, whatever returns even after you've tried to cover it with 1,000 busy distractions, is the finger of the psyche pointing the way. It's not punishment. It's guidance. And the call, when followed, dissolves the weight. When ignored, it turns into prolonged suffering. Pain is the map. Here is the point that needs to be said carefully. Following the call rarely means dramatic, visible changes. No one needs to quit their profession, move to another country, or abandon their family. The first step is internal. It's beginning to listen. Listening to what has been wanting to be heard and had no space for it. And there's a detail Jung insisted on pointing out. Most people confuse the call of the psyche with just any desire. They imagine it's enough to switch jobs, start a new relationship, move to a new city, and there you go. The restlessness will disappear. But this deeper restlessness isn't superficial. It is not satisfied by a change of scenery. It demands a dive, not a shift in landscape. That's why so many people repeat, over the course of their lives, the same kind of frustration in completely different contexts. The person leaves one relationship and enters another just like it. They abandon one suffocating job, only to end up in an equally suffocating one. The scenery changes, the costume changes, but the film is the same, because the protagonist keeps running from their own center. True listening, deep listening, means stopping before acting. It means not using external agitation as an answer to a call that came from silence. It means giving credit to the inner voice before fixing anything out there. There is a gigantic difference between reacting to restlessness and responding to it. The one who reacts moves in order to stop feeling. The one who responds quiets down in order to understand what is being asked. The first attitude multiplies problems and speeds up exhaustion. The second, slower and less spectacular, leads to changes that actually hold up over time. One of the most liberating reads Watts left us is in the book The Wisdom of Insecurity. He starts from an almost obvious observation that most people go their entire lives without noticing. All of modern man's psychic energy is spent trying to create absolute certainties in a universe of constant change. We want guarantees about the future, about people, about ourselves, about feelings, about projects. And when those guarantees don't come, or when they come and fall apart, we panic. The paradox is cruel. The harder a person tries to cling to security, the more insecure they feel. Because life doesn't operate on that logic. Life flows. Everything in it is passage. Dawn dissolves into morning, morning into afternoon, afternoon into night. Without asking permission, the people you once loved have changed. The ones who hurt you have also changed. You yourself or someone else compared to who you were 10 years ago. The attempt to freeze all of this is what produces the most suffering. Watts proposes something simple and radical. Accept, not accept as resignation, but as recognition. Recognize that uncertainty is the fundamental texture of existence, that the security we seek was never possible, that the only thing we really have is the present moment, and even that is already dissolving as it is being lived. This acceptance doesn't take the pain away all at once, but it opens up an inner space that was previously occupied by the constant effort of control. And in that space, at last, something resembling peace arises. The uncomfortable withdrawal you're going through right now might be precisely the first honest contact with reality, without anesthesia. It hurts because it's true, but it also heals for the same reason. Truth heals in the same measure that it wounds. There is also a dimension that Jung developed throughout his entire life, and that deserves to be presented carefully. After decades of clinical practice and observation of his own dreams, he realized that within the human psyche, there is a center that is not the same as the ego. The ego is the conscious part, the self you know, the one that makes apparent decisions, that plans, that identifies with your name and your biography. But beneath it, deeper down, there is a larger center. Jung called it the self. The self is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious united, and it is the one that, in silence, guides the individuation process. It expresses itself through meaningful dreams, coincidences loaded with significance, sudden intuitions, recurring symbols, inner images that arise uninvited. That whole set of ancient symbols that seemed lost in time, mandalas, figures of transformation, images from medieval alchemy, kept appearing in the dreams of modern patients who had never studied any of it, as if the psyche carried a memory older than each person's biography. And this process of inner transformation only happens when there is space. And that space is stillness. The self cannot speak loudly. It does not compete with noise. When the external environment is saturated with stimuli, it retreats. But when the person crosses through fertile isolation, when the noise quiets down and escape is no longer possible, it finds there the conditions to manifest. That's why so many accounts of deep transformation happen in situations of retreat, withdrawal, forced silence. Not because stillness brings something from the outside, but because it allows something from the inside, always present, to finally be heard. You are not lost. You are being rearranged from the inside. And rearrangement, at the start, always looks like disorder. Jung observed, over decades of clinical work, a curious pattern. The dreams of people in the process of individuation began to feature figures they had never studied, symbols they had never seen, images that seemed to come from a source older than their personal biography. Circular drawings divided into 4 parts would appear, scenes that joined opposites in the same space, animal guides in ancient forests, wise old men offering advice in dreams, rivers that needed to be crossed. He noticed that this material showed up in similar ways in patients from different backgrounds, ages, and cultures, as if there were a deeper layer of the psyche, common to all human beings, that would manifest when the ego became quiet enough. He called that layer the collective unconscious, and the patterns that emerge from it archetypes. You don't need to agree with all of Jung's terminology to recognize the experience. Anyone who has gone through extended periods of stillness starts to notice that dreams become more vivid, intuitions more precise, and certain meaningful coincidences begin to pile up. Jung called this kind of meaningful coincidence synchronicity. Events that have no causal connection between them, but that connect through meaning, responding to something the person is living through internally. Conscious withdrawal increases sensitivity to this kind of phenomenon. Not because something magical is happening on the outside, but because the observer is finally present enough to notice patterns that previously slipped by unnoticed in the middle of the noise. At this point, I want to take a brief pause to speak to you directly. If you're making it this far and you're feeling something stirring inside, if these words are touching places that rarely receive attention, understand that this is no accident. If you're enjoying this content, check out our exclusive ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes, in the first comment. It dives deeper into exactly these symbolic paths that Jung studied, connects the inner mysteries of the individuation process, and can be the next step for anyone who wants to turn this fertile withdrawal into real, organized, deep self-knowledge. Now let's continue. An important turn needs to be made here. Up to this moment, we've talked a lot about being in stillness, walking through silence, facing what has been hidden, listening to the self. But Watts would make a subtle correction to that formulation. He would say that it's not enough to be in silence. You have to learn to be silence. It sounds subtle, but it's decisive. Being in silence still presupposes a distance, an observer there in a quiet room, waiting for something to happen. Being silent is different. It means no longer identifying with the thought that won't stop, with the worry that comes back, with the anxiety that insists, and recognizing yourself as that which observes all of this without being touched. Watts taught meditation not as a technique for becoming more productive, calmer, more zen in the decorative sense the term has turned into. He taught it as a way of finally inhabiting life fully, of realizing that you are not the thoughts that pass through, not the emotions that rise and fall, not the memories that come back uninvited. You are the space where all of this happens, and that space has a stable quality that no inner storm can destroy. The moment you're living right now can be understood as an involuntary meditation. Life has forced you to stop. You can resist and return as quickly as possible to the old pace, or you can take advantage of this pause to learn to truly listen to your own thoughts, to the body, to the breath, to the small sounds of your surroundings, to the present, that complete stranger that has always been right beside you while you were looking for it everywhere else. Silence, when inhabited with that quality of attention, stops being an enemy. It becomes a teacher. Watts described this quality of attention with a precision rarely found in Western texts on the subject. He said that contemplative practice has nothing to do with emptying the mind, in the sense that term is usually translated. The mind does not become empty, it becomes open. It's a subtle difference, but decisive. Emptying suggests effort. Opening suggests relaxation. The one who tries to empty gets frustrated by the continuous flow of thoughts. The one who learns to open allows thoughts to pass by without grabbing onto them. Exactly the way one watches clouds move across the sky, without mistaking them for the sky. This posture changes everything, not because it eliminates anxiety overnight, but because it gradually installs an inner space where anxiety can appear without taking over. A space where sadness can arrive without becoming identity. A space where even the weight of isolation can be welcomed without turning into a personal narrative of failure. And the most surprising discovery for those who practice this openness is realizing that the inner space was never created. It was always there. It was just occupied. It was just noisy. It was just being used for other purposes. Withdrawal, in that sense, is the beginning of a vacating, a return of psychic territory to the one who has always been, by right, its owner. And there's a practical detail worth mentioning. No one reaches this quality of attention by trying too hard. The exaggerated effort is, itself, just another form of noise. Watts liked to remind us that deep relaxation is a close relative of grace, not of effort. A person arrives there not through military discipline, but through a gentle surrender. Letting go, not conquering. And this letting go, for someone who has spent their entire life trying to control everything, is probably the hardest lesson there is. Let go. That's all. Jung, in a lecture given in the 1940s, made an observation that remains frighteningly current. He said that modern man has fallen ill because he has lost his myths. Not myths in the sense of fantastic stories, but in the deeper sense. The collective narratives that gave meaning to existence, that explained birth, love, suffering, death, and belonging to something greater. For centuries, religion, tradition, community offered that symbolic fabric that held up the psyche. You were born inside a story, grew up inside it, died inside it. You knew what your place was, even when you were suffering. Today that fabric has come undone, and in its place, an emptiness has emerged. Modern people find themselves facing an entire life with no manual, no backstory, no inherited meaning. They have to build on their own, what used to come ready-made. And most, without tools for that task, replace the lost myth with fragile substitutes. Consumption, career, image, status, rushed partnerships, anything that offers a temporary illusion of meaning. These substitutes work up to a point, then they collapse. And when they collapse, the exact state emerges in which you might find yourself right now. The uncomfortable stillness of an individual who can no longer believe in the old collective myths, but has not yet discovered their personal myth. Jung proposed that every person has, inside themselves, their own story to be lived, an intimate narrative that their soul came to tell in this world. Discovering what that narrative is isn't an intellectual exercise. It's attentive listening, over time, to the themes that insist on showing up, the images that repeat, the calls that don't go away. Hold on to an idea here for later, because the way this personal myth intertwines with withdrawal has a turn that may surprise you. A useful observation at this point: the personal myth is almost never what a person declares they want when asked directly. If you ask someone what the meaning of their life is, the answer tends to be a reproduction of the ambitions their environment has taught them to value. The achievement of a stable career, the desire to start a family, the promise of financial security translated into social recognition. Nothing against those things, but rarely are they on their own. The personal myth. The personal myth reveals itself more clearly in the least planned moments, in the kind of story that makes you cry without you really knowing why, in the movie scene that keeps turning in your head for days, in the subject you can read about for hours without getting tired, in the recurring complaint that shows up in different phases of life, wearing different outfits. These signs point to a theme, and the theme points to a symbolic task your psyche came here to fulfill. Sometimes the theme is healing. Sometimes it's creation. Sometimes it's a stubborn insistence on truth and connection. Other times it's a silent search for an expression that was never allowed. The exact word matters less than the recognition. When a person starts to identify this theme, life gains a backbone it didn't have before. Decisions become easier because there's an internal reference. Suffering gains meaning because it fits into the larger journey, and the silence around you stops seeming random, because it reveals itself as the necessary setting for this personal story to be heard without interference. Before getting there, it's worth insisting on a point that often gets run over by the rush for transformation. None of this happens in a linear way. The path of individuation has advances and setbacks, days when clarity seems permanently installed, and days when everything seems to collapse all over again. Moments when you're sure you're heading somewhere, and moments when you feel exactly where you were years ago. This is not failure. It's the real texture of the process. The spiral, not the straight line, is the psyche's natural movement. You pass through the same themes several times, at deeper and deeper levels. What used to knock you down for weeks now bothers you for a few days. What used to be an abyss is now a crack you learn to recognize. Patience with this rhythm is one of the least valued virtues of contemporary life, and one of the most necessary for anyone who has decided to walk this path. No one wakes up integrated. Real changes are slow, discreet, almost imperceptible, until one day you look back and realize you're no longer the same person who started the walk. Now we can talk about that turn I left hanging. There is a discovery, at the end of walking through withdrawal, that completely inverts the initial experience. Watts described it in various ways throughout his work, but perhaps the most direct formulation is this: you are the universe experiencing itself through a particular point of view. The deep isolation, the one you face without running, eventually reveals that the separation between you and everything else was never as solid as it seemed. The boundaries between the inner and the outer begin to show themselves as permeable. What seemed to be outside is, somehow, also inside. What seemed to be inside manifests outside as well, and the person who spent years feeling isolated discovers, with astonishment, that the feeling of being alone was only the most visible side of a deeper connection that was operating silently the whole time. This is not abstract mysticism. It's an experience many people report, in different ways, after periods of genuine stillness and withdrawal, a kind of belonging without the need for company, a communion with the simple fact of existing, a quiet sense that, even alone in the room, you are not really alone in the deepest sense of existence. Stillness, when walked through, transforms into presence. Not the presence of another person, but the presence of the real itself, before interpretation, before the name, before the explanation. And that presence is enough. It is the silent foundation that has always been there, waiting to be noticed. This is where the paradox completes itself. The one who runs from silence never finds true company, because they carry into every encounter the fear of their own emptiness. The one who walks through that silence discovers that the emptiness was never empty, and from that point on is able to relate to others in a completely different way, without the anxious urgency to be filled, without the invisible dependency of being saved by someone. Real encounters are only possible between whole people, and no one arrives at that wholeness without spending some time, consciously, alone with themselves. It's worth naming one more nuance before we reach the end. This crossing we've been describing is not a universal prescription applicable at any moment in life. There are phases when withdrawal needs to be walked through, and there are phases when contact with others is the very path itself. Wisdom lies in listening to what the current need is, not in adopting a fixed posture. Those who isolate themselves by dogma end up stiffening their own process. Those who distract themselves out of fear end up indefinitely postponing the encounter with themselves. The mature psyche learns to alternate naturally between withdrawal and communion, between introspection and expression, between listening and speaking. Today, at this specific moment of your life, something seems to be asking for stillness. Tomorrow it might be different. What matters is the honesty of the listening, not the rigidity of a rule. The final invitation, then, is simple, but it takes courage. All your life, in subtle and not so subtle ways, you've been taught to run from yourself, to run through productivity, through consumption, through approval, through distraction, through rushed love, through borrowed faith, through anything that avoids the silence where the bigger questions are waiting. The true journey begins when you stop running. Not all at once, not in a heroic way, but minute by minute, decision by decision, small moments of presence accumulated over time. To remain. Just that. To breathe where before you would have sought distraction. To listen where before you would have interrupted with a ready-made answer. To stay a few more seconds with the uncomfortable feeling before trying to dissolve it into something else. These minimal choices, made with no audience, build a life completely different from the one you build trying to run from what matters most.